Hello again. If you are here tonight, with the lights already low or about to be, then you are exactly where you are meant to be. Find the position your body likes best. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head, the way it was made to. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next little while, and nothing here will ask anything of you except your company. Tonight we are not going anywhere loud. We are going to a small stone cottage at the edge of a wet green county on an evening in the last cool weeks of an English autumn more than 100 years ago. There is a fire already laid inside it, and a kettle already filled, and there is a woman walking home along a dark lane with her arms aching in a particular, familiar way. Because her working day is nearly finished, and her own evening, the only hours in the whole day that belong to her, is about to begin. You will hear a kettle sing tonight. You will hear a fire settle in its grate. You will hear wind moving through wet thatch and the small domestic sounds of a woman putting her own small kingdom back in order after 14 hours of putting everyone else's in order first. There is a rest that only comes after real labor, the kind that has to be earned with the whole body before the mind will agree to let go of it. And that is the rest we are going to sit inside tonight. You do not need to do anything to earn it yourself. That is the gift of watching rather than living a day like the one we are about to spend. You can simply let your own body go loose and heavy against the mattress, while hers, in a moment, still has hours of work ahead of it. And there is no contradiction in that. Rest borrowed from someone else's hard-earned evening is still rest, and it is exactly what tonight is for. So get comfortable. Turn down whatever light you can still see. And let us walk together down that lane toward the smell of wood smoke and wet wool and something small simmering on the hob. Tonight we are going to follow one single evening, inside the working life of a country woman who earns her bread as a laundress. The year is 1908. The place is a small hamlet in the Somerset levels in the west of England, a low green country of osier beds and peat moors and slow brown rivers, not far from the parish of Butley and the market town of Street. She has just finished a 14-hour day of boiling, scrubbing and wringing another family's linen, and now she is walking the last quarter-mile home to see to her own. If you had to picture her evening before I told you anything else about it, you would probably picture something soft around the edges. A painting, almost. A woman seated by a fire, hands folded in her lap, perhaps humming something old to herself while the light goes gold and gentle. That picture is not wrong, exactly. But it leaves out nearly everything that makes it true. It leaves out the weight sitting in her shoulders. It leaves out the specific ache that lives permanently in a laundress's forearm and wrist, an ache that does not fully leave even in sleep. And it leaves out the fact that the piece she is walking toward has been paid for, in full, by the body that is now allowed to feel it. By the time we finish tonight, I think you will understand something that the paintings and the costume dramas both tend to leave out, which is that comfort, real comfort, the kind that lets an exhausted body finally stop bracing itself, is not simply found waiting at the end of a hard day. It has to be built. Someone has to build it, evening after evening, with her own two chapped hands before she is allowed to lie down inside it. And there is something else worth knowing before we start, which is that this is not a story about misery. It would be easy to tell it that way, and dishonest, because it would flatten a whole, complicated, dignified life into a single note of suffering and leave out everything that actually made her evenings worth having. What we are looking for tonight is closer to the truth than either the soft painting or the grim caution would allow. A hard day, followed by a small, self-made peace. Both things at once, held together the way most real lives actually are. Before we go any further, I want to say something briefly, and we will leave it alone for the rest of the night after that. If this is the kind of evening you come here for, If you would rather stand inside a real hour of history than memorize a fact about it, I would be glad if you subscribed. It costs you nothing, and on this end it means the difference between being able to keep making these and not. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are tonight, and whether you have got your own kettle on somewhere nearby. I read every one of them. Whatever hour it is where you are, I am glad you are spending part of it here. Now, let us go and find her. It is the last week of October 1908, and along the Somerset levels the light is already thinning by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This is flat country, low and wet and endlessly green, cut everywhere by the narrow drainage ditches the local people call rines, each one lined with pollarded willow whose cut stems will be split next spring into osiers for basket making. Peat has been cut from these moors for centuries, and in October the smell of it still hangs over everything, a low sweet smoke entirely different from wood smoke, closer to the smell of a wet garden being burned very slowly. Somewhere behind the hedges a cider press is working. This is the week the last of the orchard apples come down, and the whole parish smells faintly of crushed fruit turning to must, a smell that will thicken through November until it is simply the smell of the season itself. To the east, if the mist allows it, you can see Glastonbury Tor rising out of the flat land like something set down there on purpose, its little tower black against a sky the colour of a healing bruise. To the west, closer, is the market town of Street, and if the wind sits right you can hear the factory whistle from the Clark's Shoe Works carry across the fields at 6 each evening, calling several hundred workers home the way a church bell once called a much smaller number to prayer. It is a strange thing to stand between those two landmarks, the ancient hill and the new factory, and feel how close together they actually sit. This part of England was not choosing between the old world and the next one. It was living inside both of them at once. The hamlet itself, the one we are walking toward, is smaller than a village and larger than a single farm. A loose scatter of a dozen or so cottages strung along a lane that has no proper name beyond simply the lane, built from the local blue lias stone with roofs of Somerset reed that's gone the colour of strong tea. There is no shop of its own, though the carrier's cart comes through twice a week from Street carrying flour, candles, paraffin, and whatever else has been ordered in advance. There is a small Wesleyan chapel with a corrugated iron roof that pings loudly whenever it rains, and there is a well that most of the households still share, though 2 of the newer cottages have their own pump. This is low country in every sense of the word, and everyone who lives on it understands, without needing to be told twice, what that means each winter. The levels flood, reliably, most years when the rivers rise faster than the network of rines and sluices can carry the water away, turning whole fields into shallow inland seas that the local farmers have long since stopped treating as a disaster and started treating instead as simply another feature of the agricultural calendar to be worked around rather than fought. This autumn has stayed dry so far, the ground firm enough underfoot that the carter's wheels barely sink at all, but there is a dampness in the air even on a dry evening that never fully leaves this part of the county. A faint mineral wetness that gets into woolcoats and never entirely dries out of them until spring. At 4:30 the lane is at its fullest. A carter is bringing the last load of mangolds in before dark, the great orange roots piled high enough that his horse leans hard into its collar on the slight rise near the chapel. 2 boys are driving 6 geese home with sticks, the geese complaining the entire way in a manner that suggests they consider the whole arrangement a personal insult. Smoke is rising from every chimney now, thin blue columns going straight up into windless air, because the wind that moved the willows earlier has dropped with the sun. Somewhere a dog is barking at nothing in particular, the bark of an animal that is bored rather than alarmed. And under all of it, quieter than the geese and steadier than the carter's wheels, is the sound that never quite stops in a hamlet like this one, which is water. Water in the rines. water dripping from the eaves where the thatch is still shedding the afternoon's brief rain. Water somewhere close by being heated, and poured, and worked. Let us talk plainly, for a moment, about what it costs to live here. Because the numbers are worth pausing over, and they will matter to everything we watch tonight. A farm labourer in this part of Somerset in 1908 earned somewhere between 12 and 15 shillings a week, paid in coin on a Saturday, and out of that he is expected to feed, clothe, and house an entire family. A quartern loaf of bread costs around 5p, sometimes a little less if the baker in street is feeling generous with his flour. A pound of decent household soap costs 3p or 4p. Rent on a cottage like the ones lining this lane runs somewhere around 2 or 3 shillings a week, sometimes paid in cash, sometimes worked off in kind for a landlord who also farms the surrounding fields. None of this leaves much room for anything beyond survival, and it explains a good deal of what we are about to see, because a laundress's wages, modest as they are, remain frequently the difference between a household simply enduring and a household that can occasionally set something aside. The gentry households scattered through this parish, the ones with the fine linen that keeps our laundress employed, live in an entirely different arithmetic. Fenwick Court, the manor house half a mile beyond the chapel, employs a cook, a housemaid, a kitchen maid, a groom, and a gardener, and the family that lives there thinks nothing of sending out several dozen pieces of washing every single week. Table linen and bed linen, and a small mountain of shirts and collars that must come back not merely clean, but pressed to a standard that would satisfy Anne. Inspection. The distance between the cottage and the court is only half a mile as the crow flies. In every other sense that matters, it is closer to half a world. Fenwick Court itself sits half a mile beyond the chapel, reached by its own gravel drive lined with beech trees just now dropping the last of their bronze leaves onto the lawn below. It is not a grand house by the standards of the county's larger estates, no more than a dozen bedrooms and a modest park behind it grazed by a handful of deer the family keeps more for tradition than for any practical purpose. But it is large enough to require a full domestic staff and grand enough that its inhabitants think of themselves, without any real arrogance, as simply how a respectable family is meant to live. Smoke rises from 4 or 5 of its many chimneys at any given hour of the working day, each fire tended by a servant whose labour, like Nell's own, disappears entirely into the comfort it produces. Behind the house, well out of sight of any visitor arriving at the front door, sit the stables, the kitchen garden, and the small cluster of outbuildings where the household's own indoor servants carry out the daily work of maintaining its gentility. The heaviest of that work, the actual washing itself, is not done here at all, but sent out along the lane each week to the one cottage in the parish equipped and skilled enough to manage it properly. Now, down at the far end of the lane, past the last bend where the hedge gives way to a low stone wall, there is a cottage set slightly apart from its neighbours, its garden running back toward a stand of willow and a patch of rough ground where mint and rosemary have gone half wild against the wall. A thin plume of peat smoke is rising from its chimney, and a second, smaller structure leans against the cottage's western side, a low lean-to scullery with its own separate flue, blackened at the top from years of steam. Outside its door, propped upside down against the stone so the last of the water can drain from them overnight, sit 2 heavy wooden wash-tubs, their staves swollen dark from decades of hot water and lye. Look closer at the lane itself and you begin to notice how many of the cottages along it are, in their own quiet way, small workshops. 2 doors down from where we are headed, an elderly widow named Mrs. Hale sits most evenings by her window with a lamp pulled close, stitching kid gloves on outwork sent up from one of the glove manufactories over in Yeovil, a trade that employs a good many women across this part of Somerset without ever asking a single one of them to leave her own kitchen to do it. Further along, a family with 4 children under 10 is finishing its own supper of bread and dripping while the youngest scraps happily in the mud by the doorstep, entirely unbothered by the cold that has everyone else reaching for a shawl. It is Saturday's harvest home, only a week behind them, the barns still smelling faintly of the beer and the roast mutton the farmer provided for the men who brought his corn in, and the last apples of the season are still coming down in orchards behind every third cottage, gathered by children sent out with baskets before the light fails entirely. The carrier himself, a wiry, weathered man named Abraham Coles, who has driven this same route twice weekly for as long as anyone in the hamlet can remember, is just now turning his cart back towards street for the evening, his flatbed empty of the flour sacks and paraffin cans he delivered this morning, but carrying, tucked under the seat, a small parcel of thread and needles that misses. Hale asked him to fetch for her glove work, paid for out of the week's earnings on the promise of settling up when he comes through again on Friday. It is a modest kind of commerce, conducted almost entirely on trust between people who have known each other's families for 2 generations or more, and it keeps this small hamlet stitched, loosely but steadily, to the wider market town and everything arriving there by rail from Bristol and beyond. There is a church proper in Butley, a mile and a half off, stone-built and old enough that parts of it were already ancient when the Tudors were new, and its bell can just be heard on a still evening, carrying across the fields, marking 6 o'clock evensong for whichever of the parish's more devoted churchgoers make the walk. Most of the hamlet, though, keeps its faith closer to home, at the small tin tabernacled chapel with the corrugated roof, where the singing is louder and less formal, and nobody minds terribly if a baby cries through the sermon. Between the 2 buildings, the old stone church and the new iron chapel, you can read almost the whole religious history of rural England in miniature. An established order slowly making room, whether it entirely wishes to or not, for something newer and more democratic growing up alongside it. Evening in a hamlet like this one is never actually silent, whatever the word evening might suggest to a modern ear grown used to true quiet. There is always a dog somewhere, always a gate swinging on a hinge that wants oiling, always some fragment of conversation carrying further on the still air than the people having it would probably like. And there is always, in nearly every cottage along this lane, some woman's hands still working past dark by lamplight, whether over a glove, a stocking, a mending basket, or, in the case of the cottage we are walking toward, a fire that wants building back up after a day spent almost entirely elsewhere. Her name is Eleanor Pargeter, though nobody in the hamlet has called her anything but Nell since before her wedding, and she has just closed the door of her own wash-house behind her for what feels like the 1000th time this year alone, having spent the whole of today finishing Fenwick Court's washing inside it. Nell is 44 years old. She was born 2 parishes over, in a cottage not so different from the one she lives in now, and she has been a laundress in one form or another since she was 13, when she first went into service as a scullery girl and discovered, to her own quiet surprise, that she had a genuine gift for getting things clean that other girls found merely tedious. She married Tom Pargeter when she was 20, a thatcher by trade, a broad, gentle, unhurried man who could lay a roof of Somerset reeds so tight that rain simply gave up trying to find its way in. They had 11 good years together in this cottage before a wet winter and a chest fever that would not lift took him, in the January of 1901, leaving Nell a widow at 37 with 2 children and a rent still owing. She did not remarry, though there was, for a time, a quiet understanding between herself and a widowed carter from Barton St. David that never quite became anything more than long looks after chapel and a shared pew on Sunday evenings. She built her working life instead, one contract at a time, until she held what amounts to the finest laundry account for miles in any direction. The whole of Fenwick Court's washing, 3 days a week, along with smaller odd jobs for 4 or 5 cottage households who cannot manage the heavy items themselves. Her son, Walter, is 19 now and works as a groom on a farm 3 miles off, sleeping over the stables there most nights and coming home only on Sundays, when he eats twice what any grown man ought to be able to hold and falls asleep in his father's old chair before the chapel bell has even finished ringing for evening service. Nell has learned to treasure those Sunday hours precisely because they ask nothing of her beyond simply being in the same room as her son. watching him sleep off a week of farm labor with his boots still on, and she has more than once sat by the fire an extra hour after he has gone back, simply because the chair still holds some of his warmth and she is not quite ready to let the day close around his absence again. Her daughter, Alice, is 22, married this past spring to a wheelwright named Silas Higgins in the next village, and expecting her first child sometime around Easter. Nell thinks about that baby more than she would ever admit out loud. She has already begun, in the evenings when her hands are willing, hemming small squares of soft flannel nobody has asked her for yet. Alice's wedding, this past May, remains one of the finest days Nell can remember having in years. Not because it was grand, since it was not, a simple chapel service followed by tea and seed cake in the vestry, but because it was, for one entire afternoon, a day that belonged to celebration rather than labor. She had starched and pressed her own good blouse for the occasion with more care than she gives most of Fenwick Court's finest table linen, and she remembers standing at the back of the chapel watching Silas Higgins take her daughter's hand with an expression on his broad, unremarkable face that told her everything she needed to know about whether the marriage would be a kind one. Silas is steady, if quiet, and his trade as a wheelwright, repairing cartwheels and gate hinges for half the farms in the district, carries a respectability of its own that Nell is quietly relieved her daughter will get to share in, since a wheelwright's wife, unlike a laundress, is rarely expected to labor over a copper boiler herself unless she chooses to. She lives alone now, in the 2 rooms downstairs and the 1 room up that make up the cottage proper, with the lean-to-wash house built onto the western wall doing most of the heavy work that keeps her fed. It is a smaller household than it once was and quieter than she sometimes likes, but there is a kind of order to it that she has built entirely to her own liking, which is not nothing for a woman of her station and her century. The cottage itself is modest even by the standards of this lane, but it is kept with a care that anyone who has ever employed Nell would immediately recognize. The main room downstairs serves as kitchen, parlor, and workshop all at once, its stone flags scrubbed pale at the center, where feet pass most often. Its single window dressed with a curtain Nell made herself from a length of off-cut cotton too good to throw away. A dresser along one wall holds the family's few good plates inherited from her own mother, alongside the penny exercise book on its shelf and a small tin of Tom's pipe tobacco that she has never quite found the will to give away. Though he has been gone 7 years now, and the tobacco itself surely turned stale sometime around the 4th. The room upstairs, reached by a stair steep enough to require care even from someone who has climbed it 10,000 times, holds the iron bedstead and little else besides a chest for linen and a hook behind the door for whatever clothes are not currently being worn or washed. Picture her clearly for a moment, because the woman we are about to spend an evening with deserves to be seen as more than a category. She is neither tall nor short, built solidly through the shoulders and arms in the way this work eventually builds every woman who does it for long enough, with dark hair going grey at the temples and pinned back plainly, since anything more elaborate would only fall apart by mid-morning in the wash-house steam. Her face is weathered in the way a farmer's is, reddened across the cheeks and nose from decades of moving between scalding water and cold air, and there are lines at the corners of her eyes that come as much from squinting against steam as from age itself. It is not a face anyone would call fashionable by the standards of the magazines that occasionally pass through the court's kitchen, but it is a face that has, over 44 years, come to hold a great deal of quiet steadiness, the kind that shows up in a person only after they have carried real weight for a very long time and learned not to let it show on the outside. Her voice, when she speaks, is quiet and unhurried, coloured with the soft burr of this part of Somerset, and she is not a woman given to complaint even among the few people she trusts enough to complain to. Ivy has heard her, once or twice, admit that her back troubles her, but always in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone she might use to remark on the weather, never as an invitation for sympathy. It is not stoicism performed for anyone's benefit. It simply would not occur to Nell that her own aches deserve more attention than the work waiting to be finished. And there is a whole world of women like her scattered across this county alone, each one carrying some private version of the same quiet arrangement between what her body costs her and what she allows herself to say about it. She learnt this trade the way most women in it did, from her own mother, who took in washing for 2 neighbouring farms throughout Nell's entire childhood and who put a posser into her daughter's hands almost as soon as those hands were strong enough to hold one properly. There was no formal instruction in any of it, no course of study a young woman could enroll in. Only years of watching followed by years of doing, correction by correction, until the knowledge of which fabric could bear boiling and which stain wanted salt rather than soap had settled so deeply into her that she no longer experienced it as knowledge at all, only as instinct. It is a peculiar kind of expertise, built entirely outside any institution that might have recognized it as such, and Nell has passed a good portion of it on to Ivy Coombs in turn, the same way it was passed to her, without either of them ever once calling it teaching. She still keeps, tucked into the back cover of that same exercise book, a single pressed cornflower from the last summer she and Tom spent together, picked from the hedge along this very lane on an evening walk neither of them had any real reason to remember at the time, except that it turned out, without either of them knowing it, to be one of the last easy evenings they would have before his final illness took hold that winter. She does not look at it often. She knows almost exactly which page it is tucked against without needing to check. Here is one small thing worth knowing about her, because it tells you more about who she actually is than any list of her duties could. Nell keeps a penny exercise book on the mantel shelf, the kind a schoolchild might use, and in the front of it she records what every household in the parish owes her, tallied in pence and shillings in a careful, upright hand that her mother taught her before she was old enough to properly hold a pen. But in the back of that same book, working forward from the other cover so the 2 sets of pages never quite meet in the middle, she copies out hymns she has heard at chapel and liked well enough to want to keep, along with the occasional line of verse a passing peddler's almanac has offered her for a penny. Nobody else has ever read those pages. She would be mortified if they did. It is, in its own modest way, the only place in her entire life that belongs to nobody's laundry list but her own. She also holds, quietly and with some conviction, an opinion she would defend if anyone thought to ask her, which nobody generally does. The village shop in Street has recently begun stocking a new patent soap powder, sold in a bright paper packet with a picture of a laughing washerwoman printed on the front, promising to save the housewife half her labour. Nell has tried it once, out of curiosity, and found the results thin and unconvincing next to good soft soap worked properly into hot water by an experienced hand. She has said as much, more than once, to anyone patient enough to listen, and there is something almost stubborn in her insistence on it, a working woman's quiet refusal to let a factory in some distant city tell her that the trade she has spent 30 years mastering can be replaced by a shilling's worth of powder in a paper bag. Today has been what she and every other laundress in the district simply call a wash day, though the word does no justice at all to what it actually contains. It began before 5 this morning in the dark, and it will not properly end until she has banked her own fire tonight and climbed the narrow stair to bed. Fenwick Court sends its washing to her 3 days out of every week, arriving Monday by the estate's own handcart, and today, Tuesday, is the heaviest of the 3 by a wide and exhausting margin. Today is the day the great copper boiler in her wash-house gets lit before dawn and kept burning until well past noon. Today is the day every sheet, every shirt, every yard of table linen belonging to a household of 9 gets scrubbed, boiled, rinsed, and wrung by hand, most of it more than once, before a single piece is fit to be hung. She has a helper for the heaviest of it, a 14-year-old girl from along the lane named Ivy Coombs, quick and willing, and not yet strong enough to manage the mangle alone, who comes for a few pence and her dinner on the 2 hardest days of the week. Between the 2 of them, Nell has planned this day the way a general plans a campaign, in an order worked out over decades and never once written down, because it lives entirely in her hands and her back, and the particular ache that settles into her shoulders somewhere around the 9th hour and does not leave until well after dark. Tomorrow, Wednesday, will bring the starching and the bluing. Thursday will bring the ironing, hour after hour of heavy irons heated on the trivet and pressed over damp cloth until the whole washhouse smells of hot linen and faint scorch. Friday she delivers, walking the half-mile to Fenwick Court with baskets balanced against her hip, and collects what payment is owed, and begins almost immediately, taking in whatever the smaller cottage households need done before the cycle turns again on Monday. But that is tomorrow's work, and the day after that, and Nell has long since learned not to think too far past the evening directly in front of her, because a week looked at whole is a heavy thing to carry, and a single evening, warm and quiet and entirely her own, is a much kinder unit of time to hold in both hands. Let us go back now, to before dawn this morning, and walk through the day that brought her to this lane, this hour, this hard-earned tiredness. It is 4:45 when Nell wakes, in the dark, in the same iron bedstead she has slept in since before her wedding. And she does not need a clock to tell her the hour, because her body has kept this schedule for so many years that it no longer requires reminding. The room is cold enough that her breath shows faintly even indoors, and the first thing she does, before her feet have properly touched the floorboards, is reach for the shawl draped over the bed rail and pull it around her shoulders over her nightgown. She dresses quickly in the near dark, by feel more than by sight. A flannel petticoat first, then a second petticoat over it for the extra warmth a wash day demands, since she will be standing over steaming water for hours and yet somehow still cold at the edges the whole time, a contradiction every laundress in England understands and nobody outside the trade quite believes. Over the petticoats goes a plain wool skirt in a dark serviceable brown, hemmed a good 4 inches above where fashion currently sits, because fashion has never once had to keep a hem out of a wash tub. A coarse apron of unbleached calico goes on next, tied twice around the waist, and over that, for the earliest and coldest part of the morning, a shawl crossed at the front and pinned. Her boots are heavy and hobnailed and kept by the hearth overnight, so the leather has some warmth left in it. She will not take them off again, except to ease them briefly at midday until well past 7 this evening. There is an assumption, common enough among people who have never had to keep a household running on this kind of schedule, that a countrywoman's life 100 years ago moved at some gentler, unhurried pace, governed by sunrise and season rather than the clock. Nell's own morning gives the lie to that assumption within its first 5 minutes. She knows the hour precisely, without needing a timepiece, because her whole week runs on a schedule as exacting as any factory's, built not around a machine, but around water that must be boiling by a certain hour, and linen that must be dry by a certain day, and there is no more room in her morning for a leisurely pace than there would be in a scullery maid's, or, for that matter, in a shift worker's at the shoe factory over in street. Downstairs, she rakes over last night's banked fire, coaxes it back to a small flame with a handful of kindling, and sets the kettle on. While it heats, she eats standing up, a heel of yesterday's bread with dripping scraped thin across it, because there is no time this morning for anything that requires sitting down to properly enjoy. The tea, when it comes, is strong and unsweetened, and drunk fast, more fuel than pleasure at this hour. By 5:30, she is out her own back door, lantern in hand, crossing the few dark yards between the cottage proper and the wash-house lean to built onto its western wall. A wash day like today's demands an enormous quantity of water, far more than the rain butt beside the door can supply, and before anything else can begin, Nell must make 4 separate trips with a wooden yoke and 2 full pails apiece down to the shared well at the bend in the lane, filling the copper and the standing tubs one aching journey at a time, while the sky overhead is still entirely black. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, The fact that before a laundress has scrubbed so much as a single garment, she has often already carried several £100s of water by hand, alone, in the dark, in every kind of weather the Somerset autumn can produce. Tonight it happens to be dry and bitterly cold, the pail handles biting into her palms, even through her mittens. Last Tuesday it was driving rain the entire way to the well and back, and she had soaked through to the skin before the day's real work had even begun. On her second trip to the well, she passes old Mr. Silliphant driving his cows in for milking, a lantern of his own swinging from the yoke across his shoulders, and the two of them exchange nothing more than a nod and a murmured word about the frost. Because 5 in the morning in late October is not an hour that invites conversation from anyone, however friendly. It is the kind of encounter that repeats itself, in one form or another, on most mornings of Nell's working year. Two people whose labour keeps an entire parish fed and clothed, passing each other in the dark without ceremony, each carrying a small circle of lantern light toward a day that will ask everything of them and thank them for almost none of it. Ivy Coombs meets her at the wash-house door at 6, cheeks pink from her own walk, and the two of them work in near silence for the first hour, because there is a rhythm to lighting a copper boiler properly that does not welcome conversation. Ivy has been coming to Nell 3 mornings a week for the better part of a year now, ever since her own mother asked around the hamlet whether anyone might take the girl on and teach her something useful, since there was little enough work to be found for a girl her age beyond field labour at harvest, and even less of that which paid in coin rather than kind. Nell took to her almost immediately, recognizing in the girl's quick hands and quicker patience something of her own younger self. And though she would never say so plainly, she has begun, in recent months, to think of Ivy's training with something close to the same care she once gave her own daughters. The wash-house itself is a low, single-story building of the same blue lyre stone as the cottage, with a floor of large, flat flagstones sloped very slightly toward a drain in one corner, so that whatever water is spilled or splashed through the day, and a great deal always is, has somewhere to go besides simply sitting and souring the room. A single small window, set high enough in the wall to avoid being broken by a stray elbow or a swinging basket, lets in what light it can, though for most of the working day that window is fogged so thoroughly with steam that it offers less illumination than a candle would. The walls nearest the copper have long since gone dark with decades of accumulated soot and moisture, and the whole room, even cold and empty before the fire is lit, carries a permanent ghost of a smell, part soap, part scorched linen, part something mineral and faintly sweet that Nell herself could not properly describe to anyone who had not spent a working life standing inside it. The copper itself is a great brick-built vessel with an iron bowl set into it and its own small fire grate beneath, and it takes the better part of an hour to bring a full boiler of water up from cold, so it is the very first thing lit, before the sorting even begins, so that the heat will be ready exactly when it is needed and not a moment before, since coal costs money and Nell has never once in her working life wasted a lump of it. While the water heats, the two of them sort. Monday's collection sits in 3 great wicker hampers just as it arrived from the house, and it must be separated now with real care, because a mistake here costs hours later. The whites go one way, sheets and pillowcases, and the household's plain shirts. The coloured go another, though there is not much colour in a gentry household's wash beyond a few dark stockings and the servants' working aprons. And a third, smaller pile is set aside entirely, the pieces that require special handling, Mrs. Calverley's fine lace collars, the drawing-room antimacassars, a set of embroidered guest towels that came out from London only last year and that nobody in this cottage could afford to replace if they were ruined. This is the part of the work that most people who have never done it get wrong. They imagine a laundress simply throws everything into hot water and scrubs. In truth, the sorting alone requires a working knowledge that took Nell the better part of a decade to properly acquire, which fabric can bear boiling and which will felt and ruin, which stain needs cold water first and which needs heat, Which color will bleed onto its neighbors if given half a chance? She knows, without needing to think about it, that Mr. Calverley's collars must never go anywhere near the copper at all, since starch and heat together will yellow good linen faster than age itself, and that the kitchen maid's grease-stained aprons need a rub of soft soap worked directly into the mark before they see water of any kind, or the stain will simply set itself permanently into the weave. By 7, the boiler is properly rolling, throwing off a wall of steam that fogs the small high window of the wash-house and beads on every cold surface in the room. The first load goes in, the plainest whites, pushed under the surface with a long wooden dolly stick worn smooth by 3 generations of hands before Nell's own. And now the real labour of the morning begins in earnest. She and Ivy take turns at the poss tub alongside the boiler, working a heavy wooden posser, a device rather like an upside-down stool on a long handle, up and down through the hot soapy water to drive it through the fabric the way a modern machine would agitate it. Except here the machine is 2 human bodies, and it does not stop for 8 hours simply because the arms attached to it grow tired. There is a correction worth making here, because it is the one most casual observers of this century get most badly wrong. The stereotype of the Edwardian laundress is a woman bent over a washboard, scrubbing gently, almost domestically, the way a modern advertisement for soap might show it. The reality is closer to genuinely hard manual labour, on par with anything a man might do in a field or a quarry, sustained for hours at a stretch, in a room kept deliberately hot and thick with steam, because cold water will not lift grease or set stains the way boiling water will. Nell's forearms by 9 in the morning are already burning with the deep fatigue of repeated heavy motion, and her hands, plunged repeatedly from scalding water into the cold rinse and back again, have long since gone past feeling the temperature at all, and simply feel, instead, of work. There is a kind of thinking that happens in a body occupied entirely by repetitive labour, a mind left free to wander, even while the hands stay locked into their rhythm, and this morning Nell's thoughts keep drifting, as they have most mornings this autumn, toward Alice, and the baby due sometime around Easter. She has not told her daughter yet about the small flannel squares hemmed and folded away in the linen chest, has not decided whether it is a gift she wants to give early or hold back until there is a reason certain enough to give it. She thinks, too, about whether Alice's own hands will end up doing this same work someday, and finds she cannot decide whether she hopes for that or against it, since the trade has fed her and shamed her in almost equal measure across 30 years, and she has never quite settled which of those 2 truths weighs heavier. Around 9:30, Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper up at the court, sends a kitchen girl down with a jug of small beer and a message about the guest towels, which the family apparently needs finished a day earlier than planned because visitors are arriving from Bath on Thursday instead of Friday. Nell receives this news the way she receives most requests from the big house, with a polite nod and a private recalculation of an already tightly planned week, and says nothing of the extra hour it will now cost her. Because saying so has never once changed the outcome and only ever cost her the housekeeper's goodwill, which is worth more to her livelihood than an hour of complaint ever could be. By 10, the first boiled load comes out, lifted from the copper with long wooden tongs into a rinsing tub of merely hot rather than scalding water, then again into a second tub gone cool, each rinse meant to carry away the last traces of soap before the whole sodden mass is wrung. Wringing by hand is a trial all its own. Twisting a soaked bedsheet dry with nothing but 2 aching wrists takes a specific kind of strength that has no comparable modern task, and Nell can wring a sheet nearly bone dry in under a minute. A skill she is quietly, privately proud of, though nobody has ever thought to ask her about it or to notice that it is a skill at all. There is more to understand here about what a morning like this actually demands of a body, and we will come back to it properly in a little while. For now, know only that by 11 o'clock, with half the boiling still ahead of her, and the whole of the wringing and the first hanging still to come, Nell has already done more physical labour than most people in this century, or in ours, will do in an entire week. That fatigue costs something, And it is worth stopping here to talk plainly about what. Because the arrangement that keeps Nell working this hard is built entirely out of shillings and pence, and those numbers tell a story every bit as revealing as anything we will watch her hands actually do. Fenwick Court pays Nell by the dozen pieces, which was, in 1908, the standard way a laundress's labour was priced across most of rural England. A dozen plain items, sheets or pillowcases or the like, brings her roughly 8p to a shilling, depending on the state they arrive in and how much bleaching or stain work they demand. Fine items, the lace collars and embroidered guest towels that require special handling, are charged separately and higher, because the skill required is higher and because the risk of ruining something irreplaceable sits entirely on Nell's shoulders rather than the family's. On a heavy week like this one, moving perhaps 14 or 15 dozen pieces through her hands, Nell can expect to clear somewhere close to 12 shillings from the court's account alone, with a further few shillings coming in from the smaller cottage households she serves on the side. It is worth knowing, too, that Nell is very far from alone in this trade. The national census, taken only a few years before tonight's story, counted laundry work as one of the largest single occupations recorded for women in England outside domestic service proper. A vast, largely invisible workforce of hundreds of thousands scattered across cottages and courtyards and commercial laundries in every county, doing precisely this labour, at precisely these wages, for households that rarely gave a single one of them a second thought. Nell is not an unusual figure in her century. She is, in fact, one of a great many women quietly holding up the visible respectability of a great many households. A workforce so large and so ordinary that it became, in its own way, almost invisible simply by being everywhere at once. Set that beside what else is available to a woman of her station in this district. A farm labourer's wife taking in field work at harvest might earn a shilling a day for perhaps 6 weeks of the year and nothing at all the rest of it. A young unmarried woman going into the shoe works at street can earn 8 or 9 shillings a week on a regular wage, steady and predictable. Though the hours are long and the work is entirely someone else's to direct, rather than her own to arrange, domestic service, the other great employer of women in this county, might offer a live-in housemaid her board and perhaps £10 or £12 a year in wages, which sounds respectable until you remember it comes with almost no freedom of movement and no home of her own to return to once the working day is done. Nell's arrangement, by comparison, sits somewhere unusual in that landscape. She earns roughly what a factory girl earns, sometimes a little more in a heavy week, but she earns it as her own mistress, in her own wash-house, on her own hours, answerable to no overseer standing over her shoulder counting minutes. That independence is worth something that does not show up in the shillings column at all, though it comes at the cost of a body that must simply keep working, week after week, with no sick pay and no pension waiting for her at the far end of it. Only whatever she has managed to set by herself. Now consider what all of this costs to actually run. Because a laundress in Nell's position is not merely selling her labour, she is also fronting the materials that labour requires. A pound of good soft soap runs 3p to 4p, and a household wash of this size uses several pounds of it a week. Starch comes in penny packets, and a heavy wash day, like today's, will use half a dozen of them before Thursday's ironing is even finished. The blue bag, a small muslin sachet of laundry blue, used to counteract the yellowing that plain soap leaves in white linen, costs a penny or two and must be replaced regularly. Coal for the copper boiler, since peat alone does not burn hot enough to keep a rolling boil going for hours at a stretch, runs perhaps 6p a week in the coldest months, a real expense that Nell must set aside before she ever counts a single shilling as her own profit. There is the equipment itself too, bought once and made to last a working lifetime, because replacing it is simply not an option most years. The copper boiler built into her wash-house would have cost several pounds when it was installed, a sum equivalent to weeks of her total earnings, and it was very likely there before she ever moved into this cottage, inherited along with the tenancy from whichever laundress worked this same lane before her. The mangle, a heavy-geared device of iron rollers used to press water from the largest items faster than hand-wringing allows, represents a similar outlay, and a good posser or dolly stick, while cheap enough on its own, wears out its handle every few years from sheer use and must be replaced from her own pocket. For the Calverleys up at the court, none of this arithmetic registers as arithmetic at all. It registers simply as appearance, the visible, easily read proof of a certain kind of household. Clean linen in 1908 announces respectability the way very little else can, at a glance, to any visitor who steps through the door. A guest towel with a grey tinge or a collar gone soft and yellow at the edges says something about a household that no amount of fine furniture can talk its way out of. The Calverleys spend, by Nell's own private reckoning in the front of her exercise book, something in the neighbourhood of £2 a month on their laundry account alone, a sum that would keep a labourer's entire family fed and housed for the better part of that same month, and they spend it without a second thought. Because appearing clean is not a luxury in this world so much as a kind of social currency, and Nell Pargeter is the woman who mints it for them, one boiled sheet at a time, for wages that amount to a small fraction of what her labour is actually worth to the household that depends on it. There is also the question of what happens when the work itself goes wrong, since no arithmetic of wages is complete without accounting for its risks. If Nell were ever to ruin one of Mrs. Calverley's fine pieces beyond repair, through carelessness or simple bad luck, the cost of replacing it would fall, by unspoken custom rather than any written contract, almost entirely on her own shoulders, deducted from future payments until the debt was considered settled. It is one of the reasons she guards those fine items so closely, working them by hand rather than trusting them anywhere near the boiler or the mangle, because the margin between a fair week's wages and a truly damaging loss is thinner than anyone at Fenwick Court has likely ever paused to consider. Against these risks, Nell has built what small protection she can. She pays twopence a week into the parish's women's sick club, a mutual arrangement run out of the chapel vestry by which a modest number of working women pool a few pence weekly against the day illness or injury might stop one of them from earning, and she keeps, in a small tin box under a loose flagstone by the hearth, whatever coin she has managed to set aside beyond her weekly needs, a sum that amounts, on a good year, to perhaps £2 or £3 by Christmas. It is not much of a cushion against a life built entirely on the strength of one woman's arms. But it is more of one than her own mother ever had, and Nell counts that, quietly, as a kind of progress, even if nobody in Parliament would ever think to measure it as such. She has a private use in mind for a portion of that tin box, though she has told no one of it yet, not even Alice. A length of good soft flannel and a length of fine lawn cotton, bought a yard at a time from the carrier whenever she can spare the coin, are folded away at the bottom of her linen chest, waiting to be made up into gowns and wrappers for her first grandchild come spring. It is not the kind of gift that costs a great deal in absolute terms, a few shillings spread out across half a year of careful saving, but it represents, for a woman in Nell's position, a real portion of what little she has left over once the rent and the coal and the soap have all been accounted for. And she intends every stitch of it to be sewn by her own hand rather than bought ready-made, since a grandmother's love, in her own quiet reckoning, ought to cost her something more than money alone. The work itself ebbs and flows with the household calendar in ways that have nothing to do with Nell's own preferences and everything to do with the Calverleys' social season. A quiet week at the court, with the family dining alone and no guests expected, might send down no more than 6 or 7 dozen pieces. A week like this one, following Saturday's dinner party and with visitors expected again from Bath on Thursday, sends nearly double that, and Nell has learned, across the years, to read the pattern of arriving hampers the way a farmer reads the sky. An early warning of exactly how hard the coming days intend to be. Let us return now to the wash-house, to the middle of the day, where the heaviest hours are only just beginning. It is 11:15, and the morning has already been full, but the middle of the day in the wash-house asks for something the morning did not, which is precision under fatigue. The easy pieces, the plain sheets and pillowcases, are mostly done and hanging now on lines strung between two apple trees at the edge of the yard, where a weak autumn sun and a light wind are doing what work they can. What remains, spread across the trestle table by the window, are the difficult pieces, and difficult, in a laundress's vocabulary, means something quite specific. There is a damask tablecloth, brought down along with everything else from a dinner party the Calverleys held on Saturday, bearing a wine stain the size of a saucer just off-centre, soaked through so thoroughly that it has dried into the fibres rather than sitting merely on top of them. There is a set of the young master's collars, gone grey and slightly waxy at the fold from a week of wear. That will need working with soft soap and a stiff brush before the copper can even touch them. And there is Mrs. Calverley's good lace collar, delicate as a spider's work and worth, by Nell's own estimate, more than she herself earns in a fortnight, which arrived this week with a small tear along one scalloped edge that nobody at the house has mentioned, and that Nell will have to repair herself quietly, with thread so fine it strains her eyes to thread the needle, before returning it as though nothing at all had happened to it. This is the part of the work that most people picture least accurately. They imagine a laundress simply scrubs whatever arrives at her door. The truth is that Nell is, in every meaningful sense, both a chemist and a surgeon, diagnosing each stain by its cause before she ever decides on its treatment. The wine goes out with a paste of salt worked in cold, never hot, since heat would only cook the stain permanently into the weave. The collar's waxy grey needs soft soap rubbed directly against the grain of the cloth, patiently, for several minutes, before any water touches it at all. And the torn lace needs nothing from the wash tub whatsoever, only Nell's own eyes and a chair pulled close to the window, because some problems in this trade are solved with a needle rather than a copper full of boiling water. The wine stain gives her the most trouble of the day, and watching her work it is, in its own quiet way, watching a genuine craftsman at her trade. She works the salt paste in with the pad of her thumb, patiently, in small circular motions, then leaves it to draw for the better part of an hour while she attends to other things, checking back twice to see how the stain has lifted before finally rinsing it through with cold water and a touch of lemon juice saved specially for exactly this purpose. By 12:30 the mark has faded to something so faint that only someone looking for it would ever find it, and there is a brief, private satisfaction in Nell's face as she holds the damask up to the window light and turns it, checking the last trace of the stain against the grain of the fabric. A small triumph that nobody at Fenwick Court will ever know to credit her for, since a perfectly clean tablecloth simply looks, to anyone eating off it, like a tablecloth that was never stained at all. At noon she and Ivy stop, briefly, for the only proper rest either of them will take before evening. They eat standing at the trestle table rather than sitting, because sitting after 4 hours on your feet makes standing again afterward considerably harder. A piece of practical wisdom Nell learned the hard way in her first year at this trade and has never once forgotten since. The meal is simple. Bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a jug of small beer that Mrs. Prentice sends down without fail, since even the court understands that a laundress who faints from hunger at 1:30 is no use to anyone. Ivy talks, in the easy way of a 14-year-old who has not yet learned to save her breath for the afternoon, about a young man from Street who winked at her at chapel last Sunday, and Nell listens with half her attention and answers with the other half, because she remembers being 14 and being certain that a wink meant something enormous. And she has not the heart to tell the girl yet that it very often does not. Halfway through the meal a bank of grey cloud rolls in off the moor, low and fast moving, and Nell watches it with the close vigilance of a woman whose entire morning's labour is currently hanging, wet with rinse water, on 2 lines strung between apple trees, with no roof over any of it. A shower now would mean starting the rinsing of 6 items over again, since rain falling on drying linen carries its own grit and smoke from every chimney in the hamlet, and will undo an hour's careful work in a matter of minutes. She sends Ivy out twice in the space of 10 minutes simply to watch the sky, and when the cloud finally passes them by to the north without dropping more than a few token spots, she allows herself something close to relief. The kind of small mercy that never shows up in any tally of a laundress's earnings, but that shapes her entire day all the same. By 1:30 they are back at it, and this is where the day turns properly dangerous, in a way that the finished, folded linen arriving back at the court on Friday never hints at. The copper is still at a full rolling boil for the second and heaviest load, and lifting a sodden sheet from that water with wooden tongs requires a steadiness that 4 hours of prior labour have already worn thin. Nell has the scars to prove what happens when that steadiness fails. A pale mark along her left forearm from a splash of boiling water 2 winters ago that never fully faded. And a story, which she tells rarely and only when pressed, about the year before that, when Ivy's predecessor, a girl named Susan, who has since married and moved to Yeovil, caught her sleeve in the mangle's rollers and came within an inch of a hand that would never have worked again. There is no factory inspector visiting this wash house. There is no safety notice pinned to any wall. There is only 2 women, one of them a girl not yet 15, working steadily and carefully around a machine built entirely without any thought for what might go wrong. There is a rough division of labour between the 2 women that has settled into place over the past year without either of them ever sitting down to discuss it directly. Nell manages anything that requires judgment, the diagnosis of a stain, the decision about how long a piece can safely boil, the delicate handling of the lace and the fine linen. Ivy manages the sheer repetitive volume, feeding the mangle, turning the posser, carrying baskets between the tubs and the drying lines, tasks that ask for strength and steadiness rather than years of accumulated knowledge. It is, in its own small way, an apprenticeship, though nobody involved would ever think to call it that, and Ivy is slowly, piece by piece, being handed the beginnings of a trade that could, if she wanted it, support her the same way it has supported Nell for 3 decades. The afternoon passes in a rhythm that has almost no variation and asks, for that very reason, an enormous amount of a person. Boil, lift, rinse hot, rinse cool, wring, hang, boil, lift, rinse hot, rinse cool, wring, hang. A robin has taken to following the 2 of them about the yard through the middle hours of the day, bold enough now to hop within a few feet of the wash tubs whenever the ground gets disturbed and some small grub or worm turned up in the process, and Nell has taken to leaving a few crumbs from her dinner on the low wall for it, without ever quite admitting to Ivy that she has started to think of the bird as company. It is a small thing, hardly worth mentioning, and yet it is exactly the kind of small thing that makes an otherwise punishing day bearable. A flash of rust-coloured feather against the grey stone wall, noticed and enjoyed in the 3 seconds she can spare for it between one task and the next. By 3 the drying lines between the apple trees are full. Sheets and shirts and aprons moving gently in whatever wind the afternoon can still offer, and Nell allows herself, for perhaps the length of one held breath, to simply look at them. There is something in the sight of a line of clean washing, ordinary as it has become to her after 30 years, that still catches her somewhere just under the ribs. It is proof, plain and visible against the grey Somerset sky, that a hard morning has actually produced something, that the ache in her shoulders has been traded for a result she can see with her own 2 eyes. By 4 the last of the boiling is finished, and what remains is the long, unglamorous work of rinsing every single piece a final time in cold water to set the finish and carry away the last trace of soap, since anything left behind will yellow the fabric within a week and undo the entire day's labour before the court has even had the chance to use it. The mangle takes over a good deal of this final stretch, its 2 heavy wooden rollers turned by a hand crank that Ivy manages while Nell feeds each dripping sheet through the gap between them, the water squeezed out in a steady grey stream that runs off into a wooden trough and out through a hole in the wall to the yard beyond. It is faster than wringing by hand, considerably, but it demands its own constant watchfulness, since fingers feeding cloth into a set of rollers under that much pressure have nowhere pleasant to go if they follow the fabric even a moment too long. And Nell keeps half her attention always on Ivy's hands rather than her own, the way any experienced woman minds the safety of the less experienced one working beside her without ever once making a show of doing so. Ivy's hands, by this hour, have gone red and slightly swollen at the knuckles, and Nell sends her home a little early, at 4:30, over the girl's own mild protest, because a 14-year-old's body has limits that Nell's own, hardened by 3 decades of this same work, no longer quite remembers having. Alone now, Nell finishes the last of the rinsing herself, wrings what remains, and carries the final baskets out to whatever line space is left, working by a light that is already beginning at 5:30 to fail. There is a particular quiet that settles over a wash-house in these last hours, once the boiler fire has been let die down and the steam has thinned to almost nothing. A quiet that feels earned rather than simply arrived at. Her back aches in a low, steady way that has become so constant across the years that she has largely stopped registering it as pain at all, the way a person stops hearing a clock that has ticked in the same room for long enough. Her hands, when she finally has a moment to look at them properly, are cracked at 3 of the knuckles and reddened past their natural colour, and she rubs a little of the tallow she keeps in her apron pocket into the worst of the cracks, a small habitual mercy she affords herself several times through every working day. There is more to understand here about what this work actually costs a body over years rather than hours, and it is worth pausing on before we follow her home. There is a broader question worth sitting with here, which is why a trade this demanding, this widespread, and this clearly essential to the visible order of Edwardian society attracted so little serious medical or social attention in its own time. Part of the answer is simple enough. The women doing this work were, almost without exception, poor, rural, or working class, and largely without any organized voice in the institutions that might otherwise have studied or protected them. Doctors of the period wrote at length about the health of miners, of factory operatives, of soldiers, trades dominated by men and visible to the state in ways a woman working alone in her own cottage scullery simply never was. Nell's occupational hazards existed in exactly the same physical reality as a miner's did. They simply existed behind a closed cottage door, in a trade too scattered and too female to attract the same official curiosity. A doctor examining a laundress of Nell's age and experience in 1908, had one ever bothered to do so in any systematic way, would have found a body shaped entirely by its labour. The way a river shapes the stone it has spent decades running over. Her right forearm and shoulder are noticeably more developed than her left, built up over 30 years of scrubbing and wringing in the same repeated motion. Her knees carry the beginnings of a stiffness that will only worsen, the direct result of standing for 10 or more hours a day on cold stone flags that never fully dry. Her knuckles are permanently roughened, the skin thickened in places and cracked in others, from a daily rotation between scalding water and cold that no ordinary skin was built to withstand indefinitely. The chest is where the real danger lives, though a wash house is, by its very design, a room kept as hot and steam thick as possible for hours on end, followed inevitably by a walk home through open, often wet, autumn or winter air. That contrast, repeated daily across decades, was understood by physicians of the period to be genuinely harmful, and laundresses as an occupational group carried some of the higher rates of chronic bronchitis and related chest complaints recorded among working women of this era. It was not a mysterious ailment. It had an obvious, physical cause, and everyone in the trade knew it, the way a miner knows what coal dust eventually does to a pair of lungs, without any need of a doctor to confirm what experience had already taught them plainly. There are smaller ailments too, less dramatic than a weakened chest but no less constant. The lie in cheap soft soap, worked into cracked skin hour after hour, produces a raw, weeping irritation across the hands and forearms that the women in this trade simply call the itch. Treated with whatever grease or tallow is nearest to hand and otherwise endured, since there is no version of this work that can be done with gloved hands and still done properly. Standing for 10 hours on stone flags brings on, in time, a heaviness and swelling in the legs that has no real remedy beyond propping her feet up of an evening, which is precisely why the low stool by Nell's own hearth sits exactly where it does, positioned for exactly that purpose long before we ever arrive to notice it. And there is a strain that settles permanently into the lower back from the constant forward bend over a washboard or a boiler's edge. One that no laundress escapes by middle age, and that most simply learn to move around rather than ever expecting it to leave. Nell's own remedies for all of this are drawn from a small, well-tested repertoire that owes nothing to any physician and everything to generations of women trading knowledge over garden walls and chapel doorsteps. Comfrey, which grows readily enough along the Rhines if you know where to look for it, gets crushed into a poultice for the knees and the small of the back on the worst evenings. A tincture of witch hazel, bought cheaply enough from the chemist in street, goes on to bruises and minor scalds. And for the chest, on the nights when a cough settles in and refuses to shift, there is goose grease, warmed slightly and worked into the skin beneath a strip of old flannel. A remedy Nell's own mother swore by, and that Nell has never found any good reason to abandon, whatever a Bath physician might make of it. It is worth saying, too, that the popular imagination of this century did the laundress few favours when it came to picturing any of this honestly. The comic postcards sold in seaside towns and the music hall songs both like to draw her as a stout, red-faced, gin-fond figure, more caricature than person, good for a cheap laugh and rarely credited with anything resembling skill or suffering. Nell has seen one or two such postcards herself, passed around at a fair, and found in them nothing she recognized, no trace of the steady judgment required to save a stained lace collar, no hint of the courage it takes to lift a sodden sheet from a rolling boil with hands already aching from 6 hours of prior labor. The caricature was easier to laugh at than the reality would have been, and easier, always, is the direction popular memory tends to travel, in her century and quite often in ours as well. And yet, if Nell were to fall seriously ill tomorrow, her options would be sharply limited by what she can actually afford. A visit from the doctor in street costs something in the neighbourhood of 2 shillings and 6pence. A sum that represents a meaningful fraction of what she clears in an entire week. And that is before any medicine he might prescribe is even accounted for. There is no sick pay waiting for her if she cannot work. There is no employer obligated to hold her contract open while she recovers. Fenwick Court would simply find another laundress, and Nell knows this with the same plain clarity she brings to everything else in her working life, which is exactly why she treats most of her own ailments herself, with that same small repertoire of comfrey and witch hazel and goose grease, and, above all, the tallow rubbed into cracked hands before bed. The same small mercy she offered herself only hours ago, standing at her own trestle table in the failing light. Now, here is where most people get this wrong when they picture a household like Fenwick Court's. They imagine the servants indoors, the cook and the housemaid and the kitchen girl as occupying the lowest rung of that household's social order, and the laundress working entirely outside it, somewhere lower still. In truth, the arrangement is more complicated and rather more revealing of how this whole society actually organized itself. A resident servant, however hard her work, belongs in some measure to the household she serves. She eats its food, sleeps under its roof, and is, in a limited but real sense, looked after by it. Nell belongs to no household at all except her own. She is neither servant nor equal, a category the period had no comfortable word for, an independent tradeswoman whose labour the court depends upon completely and whose person it owes almost nothing to beyond a fair payment for services rendered. Mrs. Prentice herself occupies an interesting middle position in all of this, worth pausing over. As housekeeper, she outranks Nell within whatever informal hierarchy governs the court's dealings with the wider parish, and she is not above reminding Nell of it when a deadline moves or a standard is not quite met to Mrs. Calverley's satisfaction. And yet Mrs. Prentice has been in service herself since she was 12 years old. has scrubbed her own share of floors and carried her own share of coal scuttles up narrow back stairs, and there passes between the two women, underneath the formal business of hampers and accounts, a working understanding that neither would ever put into so many words. It is Mrs. Prentice who quietly ensures the jug of small beer comes down at noon without fail. It is Mrs. Prentice who, 3 years ago, argued Nell's rate up by a penny a dozen when coal prices rose, framing it to Mrs. Calverley as simple economy rather than as the small act of solidarity it actually was. Class in this world runs in more directions than a single ladder can hold, and the line between served and serving bends, here and there, in ways that a glance from the drawing-room window would never reveal. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you actually sit with it. The entire visible respectability of a household like the Calverleys, the clean collars, the pressed table linen, the fresh guest towels that announce good breeding to any visitor who happens to notice them, is manufactured almost completely outside that household's own walls by a woman it will never once invite to sit down at its table, whose name half the family likely could not reliably supply if asked, and who carries, quite literally in her joints and her chest and the permanent shape of her own right arm, the physical cost of maintaining an appearance that is not her own to enjoy. Let us walk back now toward the lane, towards 7 o'clock, and the moment this day finally, mercifully, begins to end. At 7, Nell steps out of the wash-house door for the last time and pulls it shut behind her, and the change in the air hits her the way it hits her every single evening of her working life, and still, somehow, never quite loses its effect. Inside, for the past 14 hours, the air has been thick and wet and close, saturated with steam and lye and the sharp sourness of hot soap suds. Outside, the evening is crisp and cold and almost shockingly clean, the first real breath of open air her lungs have taken since well before dawn, and she stands for a moment on the step, simply breathing it, before turning across the dark garden toward her own front door. The smell of the day clings to her regardless, and it is not an unpleasant one, whatever an outsider might assume. Lye soap and beeswax and boiled cotton have their own dry, mineral cleanliness to them, and underneath it, if she leans her wrist to her own face, she can catch the last trace of the lavender water she rinsed the finest pieces in that afternoon. Sprigs of her own garden's lavender tied into a muslin bag and steeped through the final rinse the way her mother taught her. A small private extravagance that costs her nothing but a few minutes and returns. In her opinion, more genuine comfort to a tired body walking home than almost anything else in her day. Before she leaves the wash-house entirely, there is one last small task. More habit now than decision. The 2 great wash tubs, emptied and sluiced clean, get turned upside down and propped against the outer wall of the lean-to, so that whatever water remains in the seams of the wood can drain out overnight rather than sitting and souring by morning. It takes her a moment only, but it is the kind of small closing ritual that marks the true end of a day's labor as clearly as any clock could. The physical act of putting the tools of her trade to rest before she allows herself to do the same. Her shoulders ache in that low, familiar way they always do by this hour, and her hands, when she flexes them crossing the dark garden, feel stiff and swollen at the knuckles. The cumulative weight of 14 dozen pieces of wet linen finally announcing itself now that there is nothing left to distract from it. But there is, in this same short crossing repeated every evening for 30 years, past the black shapes of the willows and the wall where the mint grows wild, a transition that happens somewhere in those few unhurried minutes. A loosening that has nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the mind. The simple, repeated recognition that the hours now in front of her belong entirely to herself. She has learned over the years to walk it slowly on purpose, lantern swinging, rather than hurrying straight from one doorway to the other, because those few minutes of open air between the day's labor and the evening's rest are worth having in their own right, and she has never once seen the sense in rushing past them. The cottage itself, when she lets herself in a little after 7:15, is dark and cold, the fire she banked before dawn long since gone to grey ash in the grate. The first thing she does, before anything else, is coax that fire back to proper life, feeding it kindling followed by 2 good sods of dried peat, its own sweet smoke filling the small room within minutes and taking the worst of the evening chill off the stone flags underfoot. Only once the fire has caught properly does she allow herself to sit, and the chair she sits in is the same low wooden rocking chair her husband Tom brought home for her the year they married, its rockers worn into 2 smooth grooves in the flagstones from decades of exactly this same evening use. He built it himself, in the winter before their wedding, out of ash wood he had saved from a job of his own thatching work, and though the joints have loosened slightly over the years and one arm has been mended twice, she has never once considered replacing it. Sitting in it still feels, some evenings more than others, like being held by him a little, an ordinary chair, doing extraordinary work it was never actually built to do. Before the fire she eases her boots off at last, working the laces loose with fingers still stiff from the day, and rolls down her damp woolen stockings to let her bare feet feel the fire's warmth directly for the first time since before dawn. She rubs them briefly, the arches aching in that dull way 10 hours of standing always leaves behind, before pulling on a dry pair of thick wool socks kept warming on the fire guard for exactly this purpose. A small luxury that costs her nothing but the trouble of remembering to set them there each morning before she leaves. There is very little in her entire day that feels as immediately uncomplicatedly good as this single motion, cold, tired feet sliding into socks warmed by her own fire, and she allows herself a moment simply to notice it before turning to anything else. Before supper, before anything else, she tends to her hands, a basin of warm water, not hot, since hot water is the very thing her hands have had entirely too much of today, with a small handful of dried chamomile flowers steeped into it, and a spoonful of the lard cream she makes up herself each autumn from rendered fat, and a few drops of rose water, worked in afterward while her skin is still soft from the soak. She sits with her hands in that basin for a good 10 minutes, rocking gently, saying nothing, the fire beginning to properly warm the room around her, and this, more than anything else in her entire day, is the moment her body finally, fully, believes that the work is done. The kettle goes on next, set onto the trivet at the edge of the fire rather than directly over it, and while it comes slowly up to the boil, she peels 2 potatoes from the sack by the door and sets them into the embers at the fire's edge to bake, along with a small rasher of bacon set on a trivet close enough to catch some of the heat. It is not an elaborate supper. It has never needed to be. When the potato finally comes out of the embers, its skin blackened and split, the inside steams pale and floury in the firelight, and she eats it straight from her fingers rather than bothering with a plate, tearing it open and pressing a knob of butter into the center to watch it melt down into the flesh before adding her pinch of salt. The brown bread from Monday's baking is still soft enough to tear rather than cut, and she eats it slowly, dipping the crust once or twice into the last of the potato's buttery juice pooled on the hearthstone beneath it. The tea, made strong and sweetened tonight with a spoonful of clover honey rather than the plain sugar she uses on ordinary days, is the last thing she finishes, drunk in small, unhurried sips with her stockinged feet stretched toward the fire. And there is nothing hurried about any part of this meal, though every other meal she has eaten today was taken standing up and finished inside 5 minutes. This is the one meal of her entire day that belongs to pleasure rather than simple fuel, a small deliberate kindness she allows herself specifically on the heaviest working day of her week, as though she has learned, across 30 years, exactly which comforts to save for exactly the days that need them most. There is something worth sitting with here, in this quiet hour, because it says a great deal about a whole class of women whose labor built the visible comfort of households that never once had to think about them. Nell Pargeter will never be thanked in any form that reaches her directly for the clean sheets that let Mrs. Calverley's guests from Bath sleep well on Thursday night. She will never be mentioned by name in any letter those guests write home describing their pleasant stay. And yet the entire structure of that household's respectability rests, quite literally, on the strength remaining in her arms after a day like today. On her willingness to keep doing this work for wages that will never come close to reflecting what it is actually worth. There is an uncredited strength running through women like Nell across this entire century, a strength that shows up nowhere in the history written about drawing rooms and dinner parties, and that deserves, if nothing else, to be noticed here, tonight, by us, even if it went almost entirely unnoticed by the people who benefited from it at the time. By 8, the supper is finished and the plate set aside to wash in the morning, and Nell allows herself, for the first time all day, work that asks nothing hard of her body at all. On the hearth trivet sit 3 flat irons, heavy triangular blocks of solid iron with a wooden handle fitted to the top of each, and though tomorrow's proper ironing day belongs to the court's linen rather than her own, she takes a small lump of beeswax now and works it carefully over each iron's flat face, buffing away the faint rust that a week's disuse always leaves, so that come Thursday the surface will glide clean across good linen instead of catching and scorching it. It is unhurried work, done by firelight, the kind of task her hands could manage in complete darkness after this many years. There is a real pleasure in this hour that has nothing to do with the objects themselves and everything to do with the fact that, for once, every single decision belongs entirely to her. All day she has followed a sequence set by someone else's linen, someone else's stains, someone else's schedule for guests arriving from Bath. Now, buffing wax into iron that belongs to her own hearth, she works at exactly the pace she chooses, pausing whenever she likes to warm her hands at the fire or simply to sit and watch the flames settle, answerable to no one, on no clock but her own. Alongside the irons, folded on the small table by the window, sits her own week's worth of clean linen, dried since Sunday on her own line and brought in that afternoon before she ever left for the court, and she works through it now in the firelight, piece by piece. Her own aprons, 3 of them, crisp from a light starching she gave them herself on Sunday evening, get folded into careful thirds and laid into the wooden chest at the foot of the stairs, along with 2 pillowcases pressed and fragrant, the faint ghost of the lavender bag she keeps folded inside the chest's lid clinging to every layer. It is quiet, satisfying work, the kind that asks for attention rather than strength, and there is real pleasure in watching a stack of soft, sweet-smelling linen grow neat and orderly under her own 2 hands, a small private order she has built entirely for herself, out of an evening that belongs to nobody else. Somewhere out past the willows an owl calls twice, unhurried, and is not answered. Nell has heard that same owl, or its parent, or its parent's parent for all she knows, on countless evenings just like this one, and there is something in its steady, unbothered call that suits the hour exactly, a sound that belongs entirely to the dark and asks nothing of anyone listening to it. Further off, faint enough that she could easily be imagining it, the Butley church clock strikes the half-hour, a sound that reaches this lane only on the stillest nights, when the wind has dropped enough to let it travel the full 1.5 miles without losing itself somewhere over the wet fields between. The kettle, refilled and set back on the trivet for a second pot, begins its low singing sound sometime after 9, and outside the wind has picked up just enough to rustle steadily through the thatch overhead, a sound so constant in this cottage that Nell has long since stopped hearing it as anything but comfort. She steps to the door once, briefly, before drawing the bolt for the night, and looks out over her small dark garden, where the moon, close to full, has begun climbing above the willows at the bottom of the plot, silvering the rough patch of ground where her mint and rosemary grow wild against the wall. The air smells of peat smoke and wet earth, and, faintly, of the herbs themselves, crushed slightly underfoot from her own passing that morning. It is a small view, it is entirely hers, and there is nothing at all left tonight that anyone requires of her. That small folded chest of aprons, sitting neat and fragrant at the foot of the stairs, opens a door into something considerably larger than one woman's evening, and it is worth walking through before we follow her the rest of the way to bed. Nell Pargetter's trade, the independent village laundress working alone or with a single girl to help her, out of her own cottage, on her own equipment, was already, in 1908, a trade with a shrinking future, though Nell herself would likely have laughed at the suggestion. 20 miles away in Bath, and closer still in Bristol, commercial steam laundries had been growing steadily for 2 decades, vast buildings full of mechanical washing cylinders, steam-driven mangles, and rows of women tending machines rather than coppers, capable of processing in a single day what would take Nell and Ivy the better part of a week. These were not gentle places to work. The hours were often longer than Nell's own, the pace dictated by the machine rather than the body, and the pay, though steady, offered nothing like the independence she has built for herself along this quiet lane. But they were cheaper, in bulk, than a household's own private laundress, and cheaper has a way of winning arguments that comfort and quality quietly lose. Parliament, too, had recently turned its attention toward this trade in a way it never had before. New factory legislation passed only the year before Nell's story tonight had begun extending certain protections, limits on hours, requirements around ventilation and machinery guarding, to laundries that employed workers in any numbers, a belated acknowledgement that the trade Nell has practiced her entire adult life carried real occupational hazards worth Parliament's notice. It changed nothing for Nell directly. She employs no one but a single girl a few days a week, and the new rules were built with the large steam laundries in mind rather than cottages like hers. But it marked something worth noticing all the same. A first, faint official acknowledgement that the work millions of women across England were doing quietly in washhouses and sculleries and cottage lean-tos just like this one was actually dangerous enough, and actually significant enough to deserve a law. There were smaller machines beginning to appear too, closer to home than any steam laundry, though Nell has yet to see one in person. The ladies' magazines that occasionally find their way into the court's kitchen and from there, dog-eared, into the hands of the servants have started to carry advertisements for hand-cranked washing machines, wooden or metal drums, fitted with a simple paddle mechanism that a housewife might turn herself to agitate a modest load of linen without ever touching a posser at all. They are expensive, well beyond what any cottage in this hamlet could presently justify, and slower to catch on in the countryside than the advertisements themselves would suggest. But Nell has heard Mrs. Prentice mention them once or twice, in the tone of someone wondering aloud whether the whole trade might, within a generation or two, belong more to a machine standing in a scullery corner than to a woman standing over a copper boiler. For Nell herself, the practical effect of all this distant change is simply a slow tightening of her own trade's future. Fewer of the county's larger houses are sending their washing out to village laundresses the way Fenwick Court still does. More of them are experimenting with a weekly cart to the steam laundry in Street or further off in Bridgewater, drawn by a price per dozen that a woman working alone from her own cottage can rarely match once coal, soap, and her own aging body are properly accounted for. Nell suspects, without ever quite saying it aloud, that whoever eventually takes her place along this lane, if anyone does, will not be doing this work the way she has done it, and she is not entirely certain the change is a loss, whatever the ache in her own shoulders might privately argue. There is a nearer piece of change worth mentioning too, one that reached even a hamlet this small. Carried in by the carrier's cart, along with the flour and the paraffin. Only this past summer, in June, a rally for women's suffrage filled London's Hyde Park, with a crowd some newspapers put at 250,000 people or more. A gathering large enough that even the weekly paper delivered to the village shop in Street gave it a paragraph, which Nell read standing at the counter while waiting to be served. She did not linger over it long, and she would not call herself a follower of the cause in any organized sense, since a woman working 14 hours over a copper boiler has little spare time to devote to meetings in London. Still, she noticed it The way she noticed the new patent soap powder and the steam laundry cart passing through street. One more sign among several that the shape of a woman's life in England was being argued over, however slowly, in rooms and streets far from her own kitchen, by women who in some sense were arguing on her behalf as much as their own, whether either party would have recognized it that way or not. For her daughter Alice, married now to a wheelwright and expecting her first child in the spring, the shape of a working life looks different again, and neither better nor worse so much as simply built along other lines entirely. Alice will very likely never stand over a copper boiler for 14 hours the way her mother has, not because the work has vanished from the world, but because a different set of doors, shop work. The shoe factory at street, should she ever need her own wage, has opened just wide enough in this one generation to make a different kind of life at least imaginable. Alice herself has already told her mother more than once that she has no wish at all to take up the wash tub the way Nell did, and Nell has never once taken this as an insult, whatever a more sentimental account of family tradition might expect her to feel. She wants something easier for her daughter, some trade or arrangement that does not leave a woman's knuckles cracked and her chest weak by middle age, and if that means the hard-won skill Nell spent 30 years mastering ends with her rather than passing to the next generation, she has largely made her peace with the trade, provided her daughter's life is truly the gentler one for it. It is a narrow opening, and nobody in this hamlet would call it freedom in any complete sense. Women in 1908 still cannot vote in a parliamentary election, still cannot sit on most juries, still find the better paid trades closed to them by custom as firmly as any locked door. But the opening exists where it did not, in any real sense, exist for Nell at Alice's age. And Nell, watching her daughter's life take a slightly different shape than her own, feels something she has never quite found the words for. Some careful mixture of pride and a small private grief for a version of her own younger self that never got the same choosing. It is worth imagining, briefly, what Nell herself would make of all this if you sat her down by her own fire and explained it to her plainly. The steam laundries, the new legislation, the hand-cranked machines advertised in magazines she has only ever glimpsed second-hand. She would likely listen politely, the way she listens to most talk of matters beyond her own lane, before returning, without much further comment, to whatever piece of mending or ironing currently sat in her lap, because a woman with 14 dozen pieces of linen still to finish this week has limited appetite for speculation about a future she may not live to see arrive in full. And yet she is, without ever quite framing it this way herself, standing at exactly the hinge point between two different centuries of women's labour, the last of one kind of skilled, independent trade, and among the first to feel the earliest pressure of the machines and institutions that would eventually replace it. None of this touches tonight directly. Tonight is simply Tuesday. The wash day, the aching shoulders, the fire, the folded aprons. But it is worth remembering, as we sit here in her small firelit kitchen, that every single evening like this one was happening inside a world that was already, quietly and unevenly, beginning to change beneath the surface of it. The way a river changes course so gradually that a single day spent standing on its bank would never reveal the difference at all. Let us step back now, further than one evening, and look at the whole shape of the day we have just spent inside. A single day, watched closely enough, tends to reveal patterns that a whole lifetime lived at ordinary speed rarely shows so plainly. Nell Pargeter's Tuesday is one day among many thousands nearly identical to it, but sit with it a while longer and certain shapes begin to surface, shapes that say something about a great deal more than one laundress in one Somerset hamlet. The first pattern is the invisibility of the labour itself. Every clean sheet that returns to Fenwick Court arrives there having erased almost completely the evidence of what it took to make it clean. Mrs. Calverley's guests from Bath will sleep on linen that smells faintly of lavender and feels crisp and cool against the skin. And not one of them will spend a single moment wondering about the woman whose forearm carries a permanent scar from a splash of boiling water. or whose knuckles crack in 3 places from a daily rotation between scalding water and cold. This is not a cruelty anyone intends. It is simply how the arrangement works. Comfort, in almost every century including our own, tends to arrive at its destination with its cost already scrubbed out of it, and the scrubbing itself is very often somebody's entire working life. The second pattern is what I would call the density of obligation. The sheer relentless stacking of tasks that fills a day like Nell's with almost no gap left over for anything resembling rest. There is no version of this Tuesday in which Nell simply decides the wash can wait, because Wednesday brings its own demands and Thursday its own, and the whole structure of her week is a chain in which every link depends entirely on the one before it holding. A farm labourer at least finishes his field at dusk and owes the same field nothing more until morning. A laundress's obligations compound, week upon week, piece upon piece, with no institution anywhere in her world offering so much as a single day where the chain is allowed to simply stop. Sit with that pattern a moment longer, because it explains something that might otherwise look like simple stubbornness in a woman like Nell. She does not take a holiday because there is, structurally, nowhere in her working life for a holiday to fit. There is no employer to grant her one, no colleague to cover her contract while she rests, no savings deep enough to absorb a week of lost income without real consequence. The chain she carries is entirely her own to hold, every single week of every single year, and the only thing standing between her and a truly broken body is her own continued willingness to keep picking it back up each morning at 4:45. Notice, too, how each of these patterns depends on the others to stay invisible. The density of obligation keeps Nell too occupied to advocate for herself. The invisibility of her labour keeps the household from ever needing to reckon with what that obligation costs her. And the gap between her skill and its recognition keeps the whole arrangement feeling, to everyone involved, like simply the natural order of things rather than a structure that could, in principle, have been built differently. Patterns like these rarely survive on any single mechanism. They survive because several mechanisms quietly reinforce one another, each one making the others harder to see. The third pattern sits inside the economics we spent some time with earlier tonight, which is that respectability in this world is purchased almost entirely with someone else's unseen body. The Calverleys are, by every visible measure, a respectable family, and that respectability is manufactured daily by a woman most of their acquaintances could not name, working in a lean to scullery 1/2 a mile from their dining table, for wages that amount to a sliver of what her actual skill is worth. This pattern does not belong only to 1908. It simply wore different clothes then than it wears now, and it is worth noticing precisely because it is so easy to stop seeing once you have grown used to it. The fourth pattern is the gap between capability and recognition, and it shows up nowhere more clearly than in the quiet, exacting expertise Nell brings to a stained tablecloth or a torn lace collar. Expertise that took her the better part of a decade to properly build, and that nobody at Fenwick Court has ever once described using the word it actually deserves, which is skill. She is, in the strictest sense, a specialist, trusted with property she could never personally afford to replace, and yet the entire social architecture of her century has no category ready-made to hold a working countrywoman as anything other than simply a pair of useful hands. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you sit with it properly. The fact that so much real expertise, across so much of history, belonged to people the history books never once thought to credit by name. And the fifth pattern, gentler than the others but no less real, is the small, stubborn self that Nell has carved out for herself despite every one of the pressures listed above. The hidden pages at the back of her exercise book, the lavender bag steeped through the final rinse for no reason except that it pleases her, the rocking chair her husband gave her, still in use a decade after his death, still hers alone in the 1 hour of the day nobody else has any claim upon. None of these things show up in any accounting of her labour, and none of them were given to her by anyone. She built them herself, out of an evening that was legally and economically hers to spend however she chose, and in doing so she preserved something that 14 hours of scalding water and other people's linen could never quite manage to scrub away. There is a sixth thing worth naming too, quieter than the rest and easy to miss if you are not looking for it, which is how thoroughly Nell's relationships with the people who depend on her are mediated rather than direct. She has, in any given month, almost no unmediated exchange at all with the family whose respectability her labour sustains. Everything passes through Mrs. Prentice, the instructions, the complaints, the rare word of thanks, so that Nell knows the Calverleys almost entirely through the shape of their washing rather than through anything resembling an actual conversation. It is a peculiar kind of intimacy, knowing a family's habits, its stains, its small vanities and private embarrassments more thoroughly than most of its own dinner guests ever will, while remaining, to that same family, essentially a stranger. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one laundress on one Tuesday in one small Somerset hamlet. They describe the quiet mathematics by which an entire century ran, comfort for some built on labour from others, respectability purchased with an unseen body, skill unacknowledged by the very people who depended on it completely, and, running underneath all of it, a persistent human refusal to let even the hardest life be entirely consumed by its own demands. It would be easy, looking back from this distance, to feel only sorrow on Nell's behalf, and there is real sorrow here, worth feeling honestly rather than glossing over. But it would be a mistake to let that sorrow be the whole of what we take from tonight, because it would flatten her into nothing more than a victim of her circumstances, and Nell Pargeter was never only that. She was also, in the same body that ached from 30 years of scrubbing, a genuinely skilled tradeswoman who could read a stain the way a physician reads a symptom. She was a mother who hemmed flannel squares in secret for a grandchild not yet born. She was a widow who kept a pressed cornflower and a dead man's pipe tobacco not out of some performance of grief, but because she simply was not finished loving him yet, 7 years on, and felt no particular need to explain that to anyone. Nell Pargeter did not know she was living inside a pattern. She only knew she was tired, and that her fire was warm, and that the chair beneath her had been given to her by a man she loved. But the pattern was there all the same, and it is worth our noticing, tonight, on her behalf. Let us go back to her now, one last time, and watch the day finally close all the way around her. It is past 10 by the time Nell climbs the narrow stair, candle in hand, the wax already burned low from the hour she spent earlier reading a chapter of her Bible by its light, a habit she keeps most nights, whether or not she is tired enough to remember a single word of it by morning. The bedroom is cold, as it always is by this hour, the peat fire below having done what it can for the rooms nearer the hearth, but never quite reaching all the way up the stairs. She undresses quickly in the candlelight, down to her shift, and pulls back the covers of the small iron bedstead that has held her, in one arrangement or another, for 24 years now. The sheets are her own best work, dried 3 days ago on the line strung between the willows at the bottom of her garden, and brought in that same afternoon smelling faintly of the lavender she keeps folded into the chest beside them. She slides beneath them and feels, for just a moment, the cool crispness of good sun-dried linen against tired skin, before her own warmth begins to soften it. Over the sheets she draws up a heavy wool quilt, hand-stitched by her own mother 40 years before, and mended by Nell herself more times than she could easily count, and she pulls it close around her shoulders the way she has pulled it close on 10,000 nights before this one. She blows out the candle, and the only light left in the room comes from downstairs, a faint orange glow climbing the stairwell from the banked fire below, just enough to catch the whitewashed wall opposite her bed and hold it in a soft, moving warmth that has nothing urgent about it at all. She lies still for a moment, feeling the ache in her shoulders and the stiffness in her hands settle into the mattress beneath her. And she does what she does most nights at this hour, which is nothing at all. No worry follows her up these stairs that she allows to keep her waiting. Tomorrow's starching and bluing are already accounted for, noted in shorthand only she could read, in the front pages of the same exercise book that holds, in its back pages, the hymns nobody else has ever seen. Downstairs the fire settles once more with a small collapse of ash, and outside, past the shuttered window, the lane is entirely dark and entirely quiet. No cart, no dog, no voice, only the wind moving steadily through wet that's the way it has moved through it every night this cottage has stood. Somewhere beyond the willows the owl calls once more, further off now, and is answered this time by nothing but the wind. Tomorrow will bring its own version of today, the starch and the blue bag and the heavy irons warming on the trivet. And after that Thursday's ironing, and Friday's walk to the court with baskets balanced against her hip, and Monday, faithfully, will bring the whole cycle around again before this week has even finished properly ending. That is simply how a life like Nell's is built. One wash day folding into the next with barely a seam between them. But none of that has arrived yet. Tonight, right now, in this one quiet hour, there is only the dark and the quilt, and the last of the fire's warmth climbing the stairs to find her. And a woman finally, completely at rest. I hope, wherever you are listening from, that some of that rest has found its way to you as well. You have done nothing today that Nell would recognize as labor, and yet I suspect you needed this stillness every bit as much as she did. That is a strange thing about rest. It does not always ask what kind of day earned it. The fire has burned down to its last coals in that small stone cottage, and the story we came to tell is finished. But the woman was real, in every way that matters, built from 1,000 women very much like her, who lived and worked and loved and grew tired along lanes just like this one. All across a county that has long since forgotten most of their names. You have spent an evening in her world tonight, my friend, and that is a small thing, and also not a small thing at all. Sleep now, if you are ready. The lane outside your own window is quiet too. Good night.